I recently sat down with Adam Robbert for a conversation about attention, what it is, why it matters, and how it might be trained. The inspiration for this episode came from a chapter in Adam's book, Practice in Still Life. The chapter was titled, Attention is an Art Form. Adam is a philosopher and co-founder of the Theōros Project, a San Francisco-based event series exploring the role of contemplation in the humanities. His work, grounded in Western philosophical traditions, bridges philosophy, religion, and perceptual practice. In our conversation, we explored attention not just as a mental function, but as a skill, something that can be refined through practices like contemplative prayer and memory work. And we discussed how the vocation of scholarship can be enhanced by these types of practices. We also talked about the challenges of modern attention, especially in a world shaped by digital distractions, and the importance of building new institutional forms for the humanities. Adam's Theōros Project is an experiment in this direction. This is a conversation about training perception, resisting ideological capture, and how those are connected to our well-being. I hope you enjoy it. Adam, how are you?
Doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Really glad that we could set this up and talk about attention. It's a topic that we're paying a little more attention to at Tusk and Quill. We're trying to curate some pieces around it, and so I'd love to start a little bit with just kind of broadly, what is your understanding of attention? What is it, and why do you think it's so important?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I approach the question of attention from a couple of different perspectives, mostly coming out of philosophical, religious, and spiritual traditions, particularly as they show up in the West. And for me, I've come to see attention as something like the central starting point for philosophy itself, so that philosophers throughout history have tried to identify what they sometimes call first philosophy, or what's actually primary, what needs to be there first in order for the rest of philosophy to get going. And so sometimes you'll hear people say something like, for Aristotle, first philosophy is what we today call metaphysics. It's the study of being as being. So it's a kind of, he's starting with ontology or metaphysics. Others like Descartes have kind of said that actually we need to get clear on certain kinds of epistemological doubts we might have about our access to being, our access to reality. So we actually need to start with this kind of attention to the subject. And, he's famously starting with, after I've doubted everything, what is it that I'm left with? And he says the cogito, the thinking subject. So attention in these different ways shows up as primary in philosophy. And so I would say attention is the thing that first draws your attention. It's what you end up focusing on in your perceptual field. Something is showing up as more important than everything else, and you may not know why. In fact, you often do not know why your attention, your perception gets focused on one particular thing. So again, in philosophy, sometimes people talk about wonder or thaumasein. This is a kind of an experience of awe or mystery, or even a kind of confusion, but it also has this quality of drawing you forward. So you're not just having this experience of wonder, but it's pulling you in. You want to know more. You want to engage more. It's attracting you in some way. So there's this kind of solicitation that's happening as well. But really what makes it philosophical is that you're focusing that perception, focusing that concentration in a way that lets the phenomena that's caught your attention kind of unfold in a deeper way. And so it's in that attending to, in that paying attention, really becomes the field in which your investigation can truly begin. And so that's kind of where I would start with attention. And below that, there are practices, right? So I view practice as primary to the philosophical project. So if you have this moment of being drawn forward, this moment of attending to something, you also need practices that can sustain and cultivate and narrate both to yourself and to other people what it is you're actually investigating. So I would say attention is first philosophy. Everything else depends on your ability to attend.
And um, in your essay, which really sort of is what sparked our initial contact. You wrote an essay as part of your book, Practice and Skilled Life: Attention is an Art Form. And I think you were sort of referencing this. There are like sub practices there that you can do. It's something that you don't have to take it as it is. It's something that you can train. And this is kind of a uh, uh, I think pretty core to that essay. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Like, uh, you know, how do you train attention? How should you train attention? Uh, do do most of us, is our attention the way it comes default? How far is that from like a really, perfected attention? What even is a perfected? Like, if you can get into that a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the thesis of that piece is in the title, right? Attention is an art form. That's my claim. And so, what does that mean? In that piece, I pull from basically three, maybe four primary strands of philosophy and spiritual exercise. So, one would be phenomenology. This is the practice of one. I would say it's the practice of studying experience, of studying the phenomena of your experience as they appear. So this is kind of a meditative attention to what's appearing for you in your field of perception and awareness. That's kind of one level. The second level of phenomenology, though, is how is it that what appears to you in perception is appearing the way it does, right? So if you take your perception as kind of a baseline starting point, you're actually starting quite late. Everything that shows up to you in experience, including the objects of your experience, cups and microphones and lights and books and all of these things, you're kind of identifying objects, all of those things, but also your thoughts, your feelings, your interactions with other people, your anticipation of what are you going to say next. I'm kind of watching your body language and your facial expressions for cues about this conversation, right? So there's this whole field of sort of bodily awareness and physical awareness, but also cognitive and emotional awareness. All of this is happening in the field of experience, and all of that is being generated for you in a specific way, right? So, in other words, there are processes that are generating that experience for you. And what's showing up for you is on the other side of those processes. And so phenomenology is basically an investigation of those two things. So that'd be the main one. The second one is that I want to draw the phenomenological tradition into the world of contemplative practice. So on the one hand, you could say it's a kind of a phenomenology of contemplation, but it's also how contemplation is one of those practices that changes how things show up for us. So, in other words, in our basic attending to things, things will start to transform. We'll start to notice different things about these phenomena that we didn't notice at first. Surely, in the act of waiting and attending and allowing things to show themselves, maybe more deeply, maybe from different perspectives that we hadn't considered before. So there's an interface there, right? There's already a notion that something like a contemplative practice, a kind of silent sitting or a mindfulness, is impacting how things show up for us. So this tells us that that first layer of perception isn't fixed. It's not static. And I would say it's not even static at the level of physiology. So in the beginning of the essay, I talk about this other phrase. It's called perceptual learning. Perceptual learning is a phrase we get from cognitive science. So not phenomenology in the sense of studying experience from your first person point of view, but what's going on in terms of the cognitive science in terms of these processes. So you can get some interface between the science and the phenomenology, right? So that'd be another dimension there. And I think a lot about a guy's work. His name's Alvin Noe, who's very, very interested in this interface between the cognitive science and the phenomenology. And what we've learned from the cognitive science is something that I think agrees with our first person experience, and that's that we don't have separate, cleanly distinct layers of perceptual processing. So I don't have, um, the layer of the five senses down here, cut off from my thinking and feeling, but we actually have thinking, feeling, and perceiving or sensing kind of merging together, right? And the people who work in perceptual learning will study people like, just very basic examples like, a sommelier has a very, refined palate, a very refined sense of taste for wine. So they're able to make fine sensory distinctions when they're trying wines or recommending wines that other people don't. Or a trained musician, same thing. They will have a much higher level of perceptual interpretation, just at the level of sound, of the notes, the chords, the progression, the structure of a piece of music as a whole, that an untrained musician won't have. And so the point is that all of that's showing up again in that sensory field in immediacy. It's immediately present to them as part of what shows up for them in awareness. So if we take those ideas together, you get something like the fact that perception is something like a skill. It's something trainable. It's not the case that we humans just have five senses and they all have sort of more or less the same properties. And then as persons, we think or reflect about those same sensory experiences in the same way. No, we're actually bringing forth, or like Alvin Noe says, we're bringing to presence a different world through that training. And so that's why I say, yeah, perception is a skill, but it's also an art form. And it becomes an art form once we can understand and see and understand this process of how the training and the phenomena and the perceiving come together, we can actually take hold of this process. And we're doing this implicitly all of the time, right? Children are doing this all of the time as they're starting to learn their way around the world, as they're learning to speak language, they're learning cause effect relationships between objects and so on. So it's not something that needs to be explained to you. But I would say that the philosophical piece here is once we are aware of this and we can explicate how it works, we can intervene consciously in how that training unfolds. And so my claim is that philosophy at root is this kind of thing. Religious and spiritual exercise is this kind of thing. And physical activity. So if you think about athletes, I've thought a lot about, done a lot of martial arts, a lot of combat sports. You're reorganizing not just your physical body, but your the whole perceptual field is transforming. And it's transforming because you've engaged in some sort of practice of change, some sort of practice of metamorphosis where the world shows up differently for you, right? So attention is an art form. This piece is kind of laying all of that out in a general term. And then in the second half, I'm looking very closely at what I probably spend the most time with, which is writing and scholarship. So if we take this sort of practice-oriented view, this sort of attention-centered view, this transformative view, what is it that we're actually doing or should be doing maybe when we're doing scholarship? We're doing close reading, close writing, meditating on those texts, and then truly trying to understand what they are. So it's applying those ideas of phenomenology and perceptual learning and contemplation to what's actually happening in scholarship. So I say, I use the phrase, it's a contemplation on contemplation in the direction of scholarship. And so the rest of the piece kind of explores some of those ideas. We have, these practices of lectio divina, or divine reading. This is a Christian monastic practice. It also exists in other traditions as well. That's how I come to it. So yeah, but it's really a way of engaging texts through specific kind of meditative and repetitious, I would say, practices of transformation. So the piece kind of lays out how I think that works, and how I think we should think about what is scholarship actually. It's not just making arguments. It's not just setting out propositions. It's not just creating literary products. It's actually about primarily about these acts of transformation.
That's very interesting. I want to get to definitely want to spend some time with the the reflections on sort of the vocation of scholarship that you do in the piece. But since spend a little more time on this training of attention, um, would you say that it's really a matter of sort of allowing more of the detail in whatever object you're attending to, allowing more of that detail to sort of penetrate your own consciousness more deeply? Is that fundamentally what's happening? Um, and if so, isn't there like a value in the screening out of so much detail? Like, um, I don't want to be overwhelmed by all the like right now there's like these papers here and there's like pencils here, but I don't want to pay attention to that. I want to pay attention to what's coming from you. So like, um, there's a balance that needs to be struck. And does that happen just like naturally, or like how do you strike that balance and making sure I'm letting more of the detail from the thing that I want, not, overwhelming my cognition?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Um, I would say in general terms, there are there are probably two primary ways of approaching that question, and they're both oriented around we could say a kind of a telos or a goal. Um, and the telos or the goal also implies a kind of orientation. Is my attention turned toward, like you're saying, what's actually important? So there has to be some hierarchy in your perception, right, of what's important or what's more important. Um, and even I would say I explore this idea in other pieces more thoroughly, but there's probably um, there's probably also a moral valence there to perception. So there's questions of right and wrong. What's good and important for me to do right now in response to the situation that I find myself in. So this question of virtue and virtue ethics, practices of becoming more virtuous, um, also intersect with this sort of the more, I would say, the more descriptive side of the phenomenology. The descriptive side would be simply observing that different people can become aware of different levels of salience and importance and detail in their perception. But the other side would also be, okay, what are we orienting towards, right? So that's where I think the contemplative side can really help that, because if there's like a very active side to this where you're concentrating your attention on what's happening, if you think again about sports or martial arts, these are moments of very fast moving kind of dynamic perceptual moments where there is a very clear sense of what you're trying to do. You're trying to win this game, right? You're trying to get into this of mode of anticipating and being able to perform maneuvers that the other person won't see coming or what have you. But there's another side as well, which is this contemplative side, which I would say is a more receptive side, where you kind of let go of the goal directedness. You kind of let go of the concentration. You kind of let go of um, the effort to sort of optimize around the task, right? And so contemplation is more receptive, and it's more a kind of a letting be and letting things show up kind of as they are, right? So you're, instead of trying to harness all of your perceptual skills, you're in a way kind of letting them go, so that if you're just very engaged in that process of skillful engagement, you can kind of over determine and even reduce the things in your environment to your use, right? So the contemplative side is more resting in something that's not teleological, right? It's not goal oriented. It's giving room for the surprise, for the wonder, for I would say at a certain register for the mystery of being in life and perception, right? And acknowledging in that um, that there's a lot that you don't know. So there's an acknowledgement of your kind of ignorance there, and yeah, just staying in the rest, and in that, I do think new things will emerge in the context of scholarship. That can be particularly difficult passage, particularly difficult concept. um, just that the understanding that only comes with reading and rereading and then resting and just letting it be, sitting with the text, sitting, silently with the text for, I quote Simone Weil in the piece, she's talking about sitting and waiting over weeks, months, years, a lifetime. So there's a kind of a patient waiting there that she sees as key to scholarship, and that's its own kind of attention too, right? So it's a question though, right? What do you pay attention to, and what don't you pay attention to? And I think it has to be organized around what your aim is, right? So the aim has to be there, and knowing what to aim for ends up being, an equally important question about perception as well. But that sets the hierarchy, right? That sets the difference between what you should pay attention to, and what you should let go, basically. And that changes. It's very contextual.
Totally. I want to get into a couple of quotes that I pulled from your essay, which is very beautifully written. As I was getting into it, like every paragraph is so dense with ideas that it's almost hard to come up with questions because it's like everyone is like very kind of rich. But when you were initially talking a few minutes ago, the thought that occurred to me was like, oh, attention is about being good at priority setting. It's like the reason we're so distracted. Um, people in their experience feel like they're so distracted. It's probably like some deep layer of the mind. We actually are not good at on a moment to moment basis deciding what our priority is and then keeping that in mind. And so
Mm-hmm.
the mind, like you know, certain various meditators and in like sort of the Buddhist school of practice actually refer to mindfulness as like keeping in mind the goal at all times, right? Like that is the practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
So um, it's like that's actually what we're bad at. It's like at some layer of the mind, we're just not good at on a moment to moment basis holding our priority. And if we just hone that, the mind will naturally like the attention will naturally become sharper.
Mm-hmm.
But then you sort of mentioned this. It's like in your essay, you kind of talk about this like back and forth kind of a process of like expansion, contraction, like a kind of yin yang of attention where it's like sometimes you have to find this like balance of focusing, but then also opening up, sometimes opening up and letting the givenness of things present themselves to you is a big deal. It's sort of more important. Sometimes you're more focused in. Um, and maybe training attention is really gaining mastery over that expansion contraction, that back and forth.
Yeah.
Um, let me just read this quote just because I like it. So and then you can kind of let me see where it is. Uh, it's in a bunch of places. Okay. The scholar's attention must be precise enough to discern subtle distinctions, but open enough to allow unexpected connections to emerge. This is a repetitious practice. You must read and then read again. Over time, this repetition becomes a form of ascesis, a disciplined refinement of perception that draws together contemplative presence and interpretive sensitivity into the ongoing practice of close study. So again, you're sort of talking about this back and forth in the context of the scholar, but I'm assuming this could be expanded to like is this what it is to sort of become a master of attention? Is just getting really good at striking this balance between um, what you talk about here as contemplative presence and interpretive sensitivity. Would you talk a
Mm-hmm.
little bit about that?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot we could say about that, and I think the word that you introduced there as well was
Ascesis,
ascesis.
yeah. If you
Yeah,
could define
which
that also.
yeah. So ascesis means like training, exercise, practice, something like that. And it has so if you're familiar with the English word ascetic or asceticism, it's very close to that word, but I would say that the Greek word is a little bit more expansive in its connotation. When we think of asceticism, we typically think of like removal, like privation, like fasting is a kind of asceticism, right? Where you're abstaining from food for a period of time, but ascesis, I would say, is also the repetitions that you're not just removing, but the ones that you're moving towards. So I would say like something like, just to think about, martial arts training again, it's those repetitive movements that you're doing kind of consciously on purpose that then can become sort of part of your tacit or intuitive instinctual response, right? But they're not the correct technique, the correct timing, the appropriate moment to use a specific technique. None of that's there sort of natively, right? But the repetition is one, teaching you something about the right way to do it, but it's also making it a part of who you are, right? So I would say ascesis are those exercises that are sort of repetitious in nature, but the point of ascesis isn't ascesis. The point of ascesis is the transformation, right? And that transformation then feeds back into what you can do later. So it's kind of like like you're saying, I heard what you were talking about is developing a kind of agency. So I think we have to talk about agency and attention at the same time. And what I would actually say is key there, especially for this scholarly context, but in other contexts as well. The other term that we haven't mentioned is memory. And so actually developing this capacity for memory is actually key to your attention as well, because your memory is actually what's storing the transformation, right? Storing isn't even necessarily the right word. We think of memory today in terms of computer systems where you download a file, where you transfer a file, where you're storing a piece of data or information in a fixed architecture. But the architecture of a computer doesn't change because you're saving different files onto it, right? It's all static. Humans don't work like that. Our memory is living. It's dynamic. It's transformative. It's relational. So when you learn something and actually commit it into memory, so that you kind of know and understand it in a deep way, you're changing that whole ecology of other memories and perceptions that it becomes attached to, right? So everything's kind of hanging together in this kind of ecosystem of your mind, right? And so the practice needs to be retained in the memory, and the memory is what over time builds up into this metamorphosis, right? So when we think about scholarship, this is why I think it's important to uh, treat scholarship a little bit differently than I think we do. If you take a basic university course, you typically get something like a 15-week semester or whatever it is, and you read a series of pieces. Say you're doing like basic history of philosophy or whatever. You do Plato, you do Aristotle, you do the Stoics, and maybe you do medieval scholasticism, Enlightenment, modernity, and so on. But each time you kind of like read the selection and then move on, read the selection and move on. And what I'm saying would look something more like maybe just read the same piece or the same couple of pieces 15 times, go back to them, return to them, read them again. And what's happening there is not that you're just doing the same thing again. It's that in each repetition, just like in martial arts, just like in physical activity, each repetition is not just arithmetic addition, right? There's a sort of a non-linear quality to it where the repetition is actually opening you up and transforming you, right? And scholarship actually should be something like this. So if you look at the etymology of scholar, the Greek word is skole, and it actually is very similar to the meaning and definition of contemplation, right? In contemplation, you have con with templum. That word templum and the suffix is the same as we have in our word for temple, right? And what is a temple? It's like this. It's a kind of you're creating a break of some kind, in the context of a temple, like say a monastery or a church or a retreat center, meditation center, something like this. There's an intentional walling off or breaking off, sort of, I would say, sort of the secular world or the surrounding world or something like this, so that it affords you a space for silence, concentration, attention, meditation, all of these things. But it's a physical building, right? But skole is actually also this kind of keeping clear. You're kind of creating this space, but it doesn't have to be a monastery. It can be a sort of an internal operation that you're doing as well, where in that contemplation, you're kind of bracketing out the distractions. You're bracketing out, what you have to do this afternoon. You're bracketing out what you have to do next week. You're bracketing out, the several group chats that you're in or whatever. And, oh, what is this person thinking? Blah, blah, blah. You're bracketing all of that out. So there's something in the deeper meaning of scholar and contemplative that comes back to this holding back, this keeping clear, this creating an affordance for spaciousness. And it's in that spaciousness, I think, where the insight occurs and also where the connections occur. If you're dealing with something like philosophy, you're dealing with this, millennia old, multi-generational conversation of scholars, philosophers, contemplatives in dialogue with one another, and they're engaged in these practices. So one way of looking at that history would be to do, as I said, to look at the transition between the completed texts, the completed artifacts, the competing arguments. Another way to look at that tradition, which is the one I favor and emphasize, would be to look at the practices that created those insights, that created those propositional statements, that created those expressions. It's not all propositions. Sometimes it takes a sort of a, if you look at Plato and the Timaeus, it's kind of a mythic expression. Nietzsche as well, he's kind of creating these sort of mythic dramas in his texts, and Zarathustra and so on. So there's multiple ways of narrating that. But the interesting thing for me is what are the practices that underpin the insight? And I think that gets you closer to something what a scholar is and what a contemplative is. And so we could say that from this perspective, you might want to hyphen there, scholar, contemplative, and that's to me getting really close to the sort of the origin point, or the place where the insights first erupt into words, say. And you want to get close. You want to get close to that point, and you want to sit there with it. And like you're saying, like, turns out staying close to that point is actually really difficult. You're constantly being, your own thoughts are constantly, and your feelings and bodily sensations and so on are constantly inviting you to do something else. So you need to, there's that sense of coming back and returning again and again, whether it's to the text or to the idea or to the concept or to your own sort of just silence. You're moving out, coming back, moving out, coming back, and repeating that. You do get better at it over time, and that's I think what's happening there in philosophy as a kind of contemplative scholarship.
Totally. And it's even more sinister than like they're just inviting you to do something else or distract you. It's like, I think anybody who even attempts initially to sit down for some kind of like meditative practice or something in whatever form, they come across, it's like you almost, an untrained mind almost doesn't even have a choice to accept that invitation or not. It's like you just slip into it, it's like, and before you realize it, you're in the distraction, and
Yeah.
it's a very harrowing experience actually, kind of realize that, like in some ways you're more limited than you even realized you were, um, and now then it's like, oh my God, what do I do about this? Do you think that all PhD programs should be the way you described, or I mean, getting into the realm of institutional reform for a second,
Mm-hmm.
I would totally agree with you that this kind of contemplative component is at least not that emphasized in the way academic training happens today, is my
Mm-hmm.
guess. I'm not in there.
Mm-hmm.
But do you think, I mean, would you suggest like all PhD programs or master's programs or whatever, or even undergrads should be reformed in this way? Or should it be like its own strain of like, I'm pursuing a kind of career where I'm looking for this kind of contemplative transformation, but maybe not every scholar is going through it. Like, what do you, how would you suggest we go from where we are to, a better place within the academia?
Yeah, that's a really good
Along these lines?
question.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, the quick answer is no. I don't think it should be how we teach everything everywhere, but that's only because I don't think that there's any approach that we should standardize and universalize everywhere. I think that would lead to a certain kind of brittleness, a certain kind of myopia. Um, I think any philosophical perspective or practice tradition is vulnerable to capture. And I think the best way to avoid that capture is um, sort of healthy dialectical forcing functions, which would be um, skillful engagement with people who want to approach things differently, but that have enough overlap with you where you have some touch points where you can discuss and agree, but also disagree. Um, that's kind of the meta perspective on it. I do think that this perspective that I'm championing is very underrepresented, and we would do well to turn the volume up on that representation, and I think we could do so quite a bit. And I think that would be um, an extremely fruitful move for philosophy in the academy, you know. And the question of, you know, what's happening in the academy is it would introducing the sort of practice oriented perspective transform it for the better? I think so. But when we if you want to think about the institutional side, you know, there's, you know, I don't know, 6 to 12 key factors that I think are really hampering philosophy from thriving inside the university in the way that it could, on the one hand, and that prevent philosophy from doing its work in society, contributing to society what philosophy can contribute. I think it'd be the full answer would be much longer, I think, in terms of what we should do institutionally.
Well, I did want to get into Theros. I was thinking maybe a little bit we would get into it later, but maybe we can get into it here. I mean, do you do you think I totally take your point that you want a diversity of training systems and types because they train different ways of thinking and things of that nature. Maybe a two-part question. One is, let's say academia or some other kind of educational institution or whatever were to undertake this kind of training. Somebody who's interested in pursuing scholarship from this sort of self-transformative, contemplative, practice-oriented um, pedagogy that's sort of more explicitly that way. I'm sure these qualities are there already in all kinds of academic training because
Mm-hmm.
through the repetition and the sort of the rigor of the kind of focus you have to give to like come up with a dissertation, you are almost already getting some of these qualities, but maybe in a more explicitly sort of laid out way. You know, uh, provocative statement, do you think this is what could save the humanities? And and two, uh, what would such a person who undergoes this kind of training be able to offer the intellectual, ecosystem of their society that you think is missing or that's not available today?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I guess I'll say on the just one more thing on the diversity of viewpoints perspective. I think you need something like that because of the forcing function. I would say because of the way it challenges us to meet each other and to, you know, kind of it challenges us to raise us up to the highest level of our expression of what we think is true, what we think is good, and you need difference for that to occur. That said, the question of sort of institutional programmatic diversity is kind of the same problem that you mentioned in terms of perceptual diversity and how do we rank the various phenomena that are appearing to us in terms of their importance in terms of what we're doing. So we also need some notion of sort of hierarchy among interpretations there, right? And I think ideally that's what a university does. That's what, the Greek paideia, um, the liberal arts sort of originally conceived, is supposed to be that kind of training towards excellence, right? Excellence in writing, excellence in study, excellence, not just in writing and study, but excellence in sort of behavior, which is, ends up being quite messy a lot of the time when you inflect the institutional dimension. But that's all supposed to be there. But you're supposed to be, for Plato and Aristotle and so many others after them, this question of like ordering and training the soul, right? Developing your capacities for attention and all of these kinds of things in the soul is also mirrored in the polis and the politeia. There's supposed to be some sense of ordering the society towards the good, and how do we do that, right? And the universities are supposed to help us do that. And I think that outside of including this practice oriented dimension, that's going to be really difficult. And I think even in a lot of cases today, and in history, I would say, the university may not be the best, or certainly not the only place where these practices can thrive, even in an institutional context. So what I've been laying out so far is very much, if you just took what I've said so far about phenomenology, contemplation, scholarship, all these things, these appear as very individualistic practices that are focused on the person and their interiority, right? So it's like the person and their inside life. But that's really insufficient, right? If you just left it there, you need the collective dimension or the communal dimension. You need the community of scholars, or of course, in religious traditions, you have the various church communities, you have the monastic communities, you have lineages, you have teachers and students. You have, on the one hand, you have like a teacher, like we think about it, just a person who has mastered the texts and the arguments and can help you navigate them and tell you when you're going wrong. Again, not all the interpretations are going to be right. So that you need somebody to kind of guide you back to the text or back to the ideas, and hopefully get you to a place where you can do that on your own. But there's also a rich history of spiritual direction. So if you think about teaching in that sense, one as a kind of intellectual pursuit, there's also the spiritual direction that should come along with it. And the spiritual director is supposed to guide you in the practices, but also sort of give you some context and guidance for the experiences that transpire in those practices and how they transform you. So there are kind of reliable transformations that occur at various stages. They're not going to be unique to you. Other people have walked the path before you. It's helpful to have somebody to kind of give you context for that. And so that notion of sort of spiritual direction having something to do with philosophy, I think is quite foreign to most academic philosophy departments. You get it more if you're going to like, a religious school, like a Catholic school, especially like a confessional school, where it's kind of organized around the religious teaching. You may get that more. So I don't want to say that it's just not there. It's just it's not widespread enough, right? And there's a good question: could you even, and would you even want to do something like that in the context of a modern university bureaucracy? And the question, I mean, I think, yes, you should, but is there another way to do it? And I think the answer is definitely yes. And so in the introduction to this book, Practice in Still Life, that you mentioned, I talk about this history a little bit, the institutional side, the institutional history, the lineages, the transmission of teacher to student in these group settings. And what we learn there is like, the paideia, and even earlier than sort of Plato's reading of paideia, you have, he's learning a lot from the Pythagoreans. They have their own school. Past that, there are other schools, other lineages, other institutions. So this teaching of this sort of contemplative philosophical project is several thousands of years old, right? And it was successfully transmitted for several thousands of years. And it's really only, you can kind of see it in the, sort of Greek and Roman, Paideia and liberal arts curriculums, but it's really only in like what, the 10th, 11th centuries where we start to get like a uniform university system. And even more recently than that, the university as we see it today as this kind of research university separated with, departments and degrees and administrators and these sort of state-run credentialing systems and all of this other stuff. I mean, that's really like what, 18th, 19th century, very recent. So the question, are there institutional forms where these things can live outside of these configurations? The answer is obviously yes. And the question for me is, okay, do we want to simply reproduce some of these older models as best as we can? Can we reconstruct them? Or are we not also in a moment today where we have new options, we have new capacities, it's the context has changed, the technology has changed, societies and nations have changed. Our ability to do what we're doing right now, convening and discussing non-locally has changed. Surely there's something there. We're going through this whole process right now with, computing technology the past 100 years or so that, just kind of dwarfs what happened with the printing press, right? And the printing press was also this sort of revolutionary, disruptive technology that made access to these texts just so much easier and so much more widespread. And we're living through a moment like that. So the question for me is, okay, what are the good historical precedents? What are the good things that universities do today? And what are the new things that we have available to us that might get us to rethink how something like the institutional form of this practice, what shapes might it take? And so that's kind of the beyond the writing and the practicing and the philosophy. That's kind of the edge of my questioning is what shape could that take today? And you see it, people are doing this kind of stuff on the internet, especially all the time. You also see it, different groups springing up, more locally. Certainly here in the Bay Area, there's a number of them. So it's kind of a moment of one, the big institutional kind of I don't want to say monoculture, but the big behemoth of the university, especially in regards to the humanities, is kind of collapsing in some ways. Jobs are shrinking, degree programs are being closed, funding is being cut. So that's going down, but there's also this other axis of people kind of recognizing that and saying like, hey, we can do this in different ways. And that line is going up. So there's this kind of death and a rebirth of the institutional form happening right now.
I'd like you to tease out, you mentioned there's the intellectual component and the spiritual component. And I often feel like spirituality, and I'm not suggesting you're doing this, but just generally, spirituality is one of these words that I bucket with like religion or politics, where I feel people use it a lot but don't have clear definitions, you know?
Mhm.
So how, like, what is the difference between developing yourself intellectually and developing yourself spiritually? What does a person look like who's very intellectually developed but not spiritually developed, and vice versa? Like, what does that mean even to develop spiritually or grow spiritually or train? So, like, what is actually are you doing? What are your thoughts on that? I'm not saying give us the
Yeah.
the definitive
the
answer, but how do
the
you think
one
about that?
the
Yeah,
one
the
true
one answer.
definition.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I have what I think is true and what I think is ultimate, right? And I can lay that out, and like I said, that can attract people who agree and invite discussion people who disagree. But so I think, when people talk about religion and spirituality, they typically have something in mind like ultimate concern, um, the ultimate fact of existence or the ultimate being of existence, God. Um, and they have something, it has something to do with virtue too, right? So it's those two things coming together. And I wouldn't oppose those things to the intellectual pursuit. And I think this is one of the things that's been severed a little bit, is that the intellectual pursuit and the spiritual religious development need to go hand in hand. And in fact, when they do, I think the intellectual pursuit sharpens and the intellectual pursuit can deepen. the religious and the spiritual dimension. So I think analytically we separate them to talk about them, and there are reasons for holding them different. Especially when people talk about philosophy and religion, one of the things that they'll say is that philosophy is about like demonstrable arguments, secured through logic, through reasoning, statements that are intersubjectively verifiable. There shouldn't be, in this sort of strict sense, an appeal to authority, and there shouldn't be anything outside of the field of questioning. So everything should be open to questioning, and everything that you say is true you should have reasons for it that other people can evaluate. On the religious side, the difference I would say is that they will admit of things like revelation. They will admit of things like mystical experience. So these are, the texts of the religious traditions are not, they're not things that are argued for. They are sort of revealed truths that are communicated to other people. And I would say demonstration still exists there, but it exists in the mode of practice and experience, right? So we were talking about, spiritual direction and spiritual development. There are, if not arguments, there are practices that lead to events that can be experienced, and those can be discussed, even if the experience can't. So that's how they might be different. But I would say that in that concept of religion, for me, you need like a robust concept of transcendence. That's my claim. And that transcendence cashes out in something like, for Plato, it's like the good beyond being. It's not one of the beings, but it's the condition of possibility for perceiving any beings at all. Transformed into the Christian tradition, that highest good beyond being would be God beyond being. And I think they're quite similar in ways, but different in others, in that the transcendence of Christianity is still a personal one, so that there's actually God, a person, not just a sort of abstract field of transcendence, but a person, and a person that you as a person can encounter, like as still as yourself, not just as an abstract thinking subject, right? So that's what religion is oriented around for me. And I would say that the limitation of the secular interpretations are that they may have some kind of a notion of transcendence, but I would describe it as a kind of a horizontal transcendence, where like there's certainly a notion of self-transformation, self-improvement. I can overcome myself, like my will can overcome me and change me, right? Like I can work against my bad habits. I can will myself towards virtue. I can will myself towards, especially if you're talking about specific skills, I can will myself into becoming a better fighter, a better basketball player, a better artist, a better musician, whatever it is. And so there is that self-transcending kind of loop, but there's no vertical transcendence. And so for me, that vertical transcendence has to be in play in the discussion. And I think that the practices are ways of getting you in touch with those moments of transcendence.
And just to clarify, like transcendence you're describing as like an experience. It's some kind of experience that transcends like what exactly? Like human suffering. Like when you is that kind of how you think about it, or it's like you
Yeah,
have this experience and now the confusion, misery, suffering, or whatever that maybe was part of your lived, psyche or lived experience before is no longer as big of a factor because of this moment of transcendence. Or is that something like that? Or
certainly. Yeah, I
yeah,
think it certainly contextualizes things differently. I would say it transforms your sense of the meaning of suffering. It transforms your understanding of ultimacy and how that suffering cashes out in the end. Um, I don't think it stops the suffering, and I don't think it's meant to. I think it's in some ways bringing you into closer intimacy with it, in
yeah,
ways that can be uncomfortable. Um, But what it does do is it kind of chokes out the nihilism. It chokes out the apathy. Um, it illuminates purpose and meaning, and that's maybe more powerful than coming up with a way to eliminate the suffering, I think.
No, that's very well said. So it sort of transforms your relationship with the fundamental facts of life, not necessarily extinguishing them, but
That's right.
transforming your relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just putting some things together from this conversation. I think it's an interesting. So I do think you're right. Somewhere along the way, there's maybe part of this like phenomenon that we call modernity, which is another one of those words. I don't know exactly how to define it, but it's there. It's you can sense it, but it's like somewhere the academy in the academy, the idea of like intellectual development and spiritual development became severed. Almost like these two things are almost maybe at some level where it's like these two things are opposed to each other. Forget about they're just
Mm-hmm.
not compatible. It's like well, they actually one opposes the other or something like that. And then maybe that is in some sense what marked it. A kind of uh, it's like there was more of a move towards becoming research institutions that were pursuing knowledge, trying to learn more about the material universe, and obviously becoming very effective at. I say effective, although nowadays there's a lot of critiques about that whole thing also, but that's a separate discussion. But obviously we see the results around us. Our ability to like control nature or sort of control various different processes has definitely
Mm-hmm.
expanded because we pursued this intellectual development. But the idea that it should also develop the human soul, or for lack of a better word, universities stop so much. Some will still pay lip service to the idea, but I think it's fair to say in the way they go about doing what they do, they stopped so much identifying that as part of their purpose and part of their goal
Mm-hmm.
is to like the transformation of the human soul. And that's probably where the humanities maybe started to struggle to find its place as things moved more and more in this sort of research oriented paradigm, dissecting material reality. Maybe the humanities was more that side of things that was supposed to be like human beings come in and they mature as human beings through
Mm-hmm.
this curriculum. And
Yeah.
they gain more insight into how the material world works through this other curriculum. But then when the university stopped identifying both of these as its objective, you kind of had I don't know, some severance happened there.
Mm-hmm.
And now I think a lot of people talk about, a crisis in the humanities and how are we going to fix it? And
Yeah.
maybe this is one direction to look into. But obviously, doing so in a way that maybe um, takes lessons from the past and maybe avoids certain problems of dogmatism and things of that nature that can also creep in on that side. Or I don't know. These are just my thoughts. But I want to spend a little more time on the institutional stuff before coming back to how does like a normal person bring this
Mm-hmm.
thinking around attention development into their own life. And there are other institutions that are related to attention. We call it the attention economy.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on that? Like, do we live in the hardest time ever in human history for a individual to actually have command over their attention? Like, was the game easier for our ancestors and we're just playing it on hard mode?
I would say it's a unique version of a perennial problem. And I think I have a book on medieval monasticism up here somewhere. Yeah, I believe it's just called Medieval Monasticism. And there's a funny anecdote in that book about how the monks in the 12th or 13th century or whatever are complaining that the illuminated manuscripts, they do this beautiful calligraphy, and they have uh, paintings and images and like rich text features and borders, and I mean you've seen these books, right? Like they're just very ornate, and the monks are complaining that things are getting way out of control, like the texts are way too elaborate, it's just distracting. They're like, we're just supposed to be reading the words, not all this ornamentation on the side. Of course, the ornamentation is part of the presentation, but I share that just to say that attention has always been difficult, and attention will always be difficult, I think. It's the nature of what we are as beings in the world we live in. So on the one hand, it's a perennial problem. I don't think there's an outside to it. I don't think that there was a time where it wasn't an issue for us, in at least in our our history. But yeah, of course, today we have an enormous number of unique problems, and they all have to do with attention, right? And so, if you open up any social media app, if you're trying to do one specific thing, you're immediately bombarded with a never-ending stream of alternative things that are algorithmically fed to you, maybe based on your previous interactivity, but it seems increasingly like it's more like attention grabbing. People talk about hacking the limbic system and so on. It's like it's manipulating your physiology. It knows how to grab your attention. So it's hyper distracting, hyper stimuli on purpose. And so of course that creates this whole layer of like other issues. And the fact that your word processing software and your email and your whatever else that you're doing is all kind of entangled in the same system, makes that harder to navigate. But I think at the end of the day, it's just it's like I said, a version of an old problem. Like I remember sitting on the BART train, the commute train going into San Francisco one day, and the BART car was very quiet. I had my own seat, plenty of room, and was just sitting there. It's a beautiful day outside. You can see the bay passing by as you're heading into the city, and I'm sitting there scrolling on my phone, just looking at just nonsense. Like I honestly couldn't even tell you what it was. I have no idea. No memory of it. And I remember going, I don't need to be doing this. So just very simple thing. Just put your phone away, put it on silent. Just to, you have 30 minutes here where you don't actually have to do anything. You're about to go to work, so just like this kind of sit and be present. And as soon as I put my phone away, my mind started doing the same thing. Like not about what I'd just been looking at, but it was just like, again, it was just like endless scroll, thoughts, feelings, anxieties. Oh, I need to do this. Oh, what am I going to do on Friday? Oh, I had this conversation with my dad 2 weeks ago. Like, how did that be? Like all of this stuff. And I'm like, oh, I'm still just scrolling. I don't have a phone in front of me, but the scrolling didn't stop. I'm just scrolling in a different way now. So I wasn't convinced that I was really any more present, I just wasn't looking at my phone. So it's a lot of that, right? And I really love, in terms of these practices, the one that I really love from Plato is a word. The word is anamnesis, and it means unforgetting. Another way of saying it is remembrance or recollecting. And the sort of very high level metaphysical meaning of this term is like it has this sort of, again, this valence of transcendence. Like you are a participant in a transcendent reality, and you are constantly forgetting. So the moment of anamnesis is kind of like something that clicks you back into that, going, oh, I've been really identified with like little me, this guy running around with his biographical life, but I'm part of this other thing. And we constantly forget it. And then you have these moments that trigger it, moments of beauty, these situations where you kind of remember that and you go, oh yeah, I forgot again. But it's also the little moments too, where you're just like your presence is distracted, or you set out to do one thing, and then all of a sudden you're over here, you succumb to the distraction and you're not doing it again. That can be a kind of a little, reminiscence, recollection, unforgetting, like, oh, I forgot. So just like, for me, that's really helpful, just in terms of like remembering, what was I doing? Why am I doing this again? Okay. And there's the short term version of that. I'm doing something very specific in this 15 minutes. There's like the week version of that. There's the year version of that. And then there's like my life purpose version of that. Like, oh, I fell away from this for a couple of weeks, couple of months, maybe a couple of years, then the remembrance sends your orientation back in the right direction. But it, like I said, this is perennial. This is a feature of being a human. The shapes that it takes will be different, but that state of affairs won't, I don't think.
Totally fair. A couple of thoughts on this, but I do believe at some level, um, well, I think what a lot of these apps have accomplished that is actually maybe new in history. I have to think about
Mhm.
it a little bit more, but let me know what you think about this. They've successfully managed to like invade these sort of private spaces of boredom
Mm,
and
mhm.
just like there were all these like little moments like on the train, um for example, like where I don't know if there was anything that in the past that sort of was able to invade these things so effectively other than our own thoughts.
Yeah,
The only other thing was our own thoughts and feelings and moods. But it's like I don't know if there was. I mean, maybe there will. Maybe people would be reading books or something, but I do feel like it's the invasion of those little crevices in the day,
yeah,
crevices of time, is feels like it's something a little bit newer, and maybe that is sort of substituting certain private moments of just being with yourself and
yeah.
your own thoughts that people couldn't avoid before, and now they can avoid it very efficiently.
Right.
And what is the impact of that? I don't know. That's one thing, and then the other thing that I want to sort of come back to personal practice and bringing these kinds of ideas into our own life, moving away from the sort of institutional stuff, but maybe as a bridge, could we use the social media apps as like a gymnasium for attention? Like, as you said, it's like you open the app and you go there intending to do one thing, and before you know it, you're scrolling. Like, is the app the best place to train that 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 anamnesis, that sati, that mindfulness of like, I came here to do this, and how long can I hold it in my mind before,
Hmm.
some rage bait or engagement bait pulls me away? Like, do you think
Yeah.
we could actually relate to those in that way? Would that actually work? Um, yeah, let's do there, and then maybe we can go into a little bit of personal practices and things like that that people could do. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, I guess the reason that the apps and social media is difficult to deal with is because I actually believe they also generate quite a bit of good and quite a bit of interest. I've had, over the years, I quite enjoy writing on the newsletter. I quite enjoy having a draft or having a piece that I can just share with people. Um, I get messages from people all the time. You reached out to me, you found one of those essays, um, had some helpful reflections to me. And that kind of thing happens quite regularly. And it happens in the reverse to me as well. I find somebody's piece and then, every time it happens, especially if it's somebody that I'm not familiar with, um, I'm just kind of shocked that I can just send that person a message like right there. And most of the time they respond and they're up to have a conversation or to connect. And some of those connections become bigger friendships, bigger projects, uh, bigger conspiracies, I was about to say, but um, in a good way. Um, but yeah, so it's difficult because there is actually good happening there. And so again, I guess it comes back to your first question is like staying in command kind of your attention, of your orientation, of your navigation, and of your purpose, right? Like what's going on. Um, so I think because I think if it was just slop, right, all the time, I don't think I would go out there. So you're kind of like mining for these little gemstones sometimes, right? And um, I know other people have really strict where they just kind of and a lot of academics I think are more like this than other people. They just really abstain, and they don't really interact with any of it at all. So I think it's difficult precisely because it's such a mix of different things, But I do think that it is a great place to remind yourself of what is your purpose and is this is this connected to it, or are you wasting time? And that again comes back to memory. I really feel like it's only recently that memory has become this kind of key through line in what I'm thinking about. And a lot of it has to do with memory. And so to the extent that um, outsourcing so much of our cognition, not just to social media, but to Plato famously has this like uh, diatribe about how writing is going to destroy philosophy. Like writing things down is bad for philosophy. Whereas today we just think of philosophy as writing mostly. That's how most people think of it. Um, but I think, what was I going to say about that? Yeah, it's the issue there is the memory component, you know, and so you have to train your memory. You have to focus your attention, yes, but you also have to do you have to keep your memory alive and active, and I think in doing that you gain some resiliency when you're kind of floating out there in a sea of digital distractions. um yeah.
Totally. And I agree with you that I think the framing, the narrative is generally pretty negative on these apps about their impact. But it's almost like because we've just digested all the good that's come out of it. It's like just become so part and parcel of the modern way of life that now what stands out is the problem,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
they've so fundamentally transformed what's even possible in ways, like you said, we were able to connect and have this conversation simply because of Twitter and Substack and things like that. So they do a lot of wonderful things. Um, Last couple of questions. I want to give you a chance to talk about Theōros a little bit. I think it's a very interesting project. But before we get into that, um, just in terms of like, okay, I'm not pursuing scholarship as a career
Hmm.
potentially or anything of that nature, but I want to train my attention. I want to get better at it. People can sense that there's something here. There's like a richness here that's maybe available if I
Yeah.
do it. How would you suggest they go about the day? Like, what are some like, what's a day in the life of a practitioner who is honing their attention? And then also, if you could pitch it a little bit, like, why should somebody bother? Like, what benefits actually accrue to them from undertaking a conscious practice in
Yeah.
this direction? Benefits accrue to them and to people around them. If you could pitch the goal a little bit, that would be good.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'll start I'll start with scholarship again and how I think that interfaces with this question of training attention. And this is actually also Simone Weil's idea. She has this great insight that what what you're actually doing with school and education is, regardless of the content, regardless of the discipline or the course, what you are training is attention. And so she sees this, and she sees that training as ultimately in service of training like prayer and meditation. But her point is like whether you're concentrating on a very difficult text, or you're trying to understand a mathematical proof, or really doing anything that requires like thinking focused attention for a long time. Like I said, probably, like hours of study in the moment, but then repeated, throughout your life. But what's happening is if you're just doing like, algebra 2 or whatever as a high schooler, and you're trying to understand how these equations work, how these theorems work, what that requires is actually like a longer attention span. And what you get from doing that is a longer attention span. And that attention span transfers to the other things that you might focus on. So, in principle, you could kind of take anything as a means of training your attention. You just need to do it, and I think, um, one of the things that I would do with like younger kids, teenagers, and so on, is do some of these more repetitive practices that I'm not sure if they're totally abandoned. Like, but we used to do like a lot of penmanship exercises. Like you'd learn how to print letters, and then you'd learn cursive. And now people say, oh well, nobody writes cursive anymore. People can barely read cursive anymore. Everything's on computers. What they need to do is type. So we don't need cursive. Like that's not a product that we need. But from this perspective, what you actually need is like the repetitive act of attention of forming these letters over and over again. And that process of doing that is actually what's important there. And in transforming your attention, you show up. And again, where we started, how things show up to you because of your greater attention changes. This is like a very simple exercise. I've been thinking maybe I should just go back and go through some of those workbooks again. Something very simple. There's nothing intellectual about it. There's no high level concepts. There's not really any abstraction going on. But that's the kind of thing we're talking about. And if you do that, you will have a longer, people talk about attention span, but we could talk about like attention depth too, or something like that. So it's those kinds of things. And for scholarship, that's how I treat it. And that's the essay you started with is basically I have the Lectio Divina. This is reading, meditating, praying, and contemplating. Is basically like the 4 stages of reading in this practice. Hugh of St. Victor is somebody I talk about there as well. He has, Lectio Divina is, liturgical, historically basically about biblical scholarship, a kind of transformative biblical activity. Hugh of St. Victor's is a little bit more expansive, you can apply it to like philosophy and spiritual texts and stuff like that. But I mean, you could do it with science writing as well. It's very much open to this kind of thing. So in that context, it's the attention and it's the scholarship and it's the understanding. But there's other practices, like we mentioned fasting. I think fasting is a great practice of transformation. And again, it's if you think of this sense of like, what is silence doing? What is sort of like silent sitting, meditation doing for you? It's like, it's letting go of the overstimulation that you're usually bombarded with. And in letting that go, there's something rejuvenating, there's something transformative happening if you do it regularly. So if you think of like perceptual stimuli or overthinking, ruminating, if you think of all of that as a kind of metabolism, you're kind of like overeating, over metabolizing. Like silent sitting, silent meditation is kind of like fasting for the intellect or fasting for the mind, fasting for the emotions in the body. But physical fasting does the same thing. You're almost like over metabolizing there as well, particularly for us who live in more urban environments, working sedentary jobs. Just that simple privation is transformative. So that would be like another basic practice. One of the bigger, more profound ones for me has been this tradition of contemplative prayer. Different than like petitionary prayer is the kind of cartoon prayer where you sit and pray, you're asking for things. Contemplative prayer is something that there's a long tradition of it. One of the people that I write about and whose practices I've tried to incorporate into my life more is this. There's an anonymous author from 14th century England. It's one of the Middle English. They're called the Middle English mystics. This is 14th century England. Christian contemplatives wrote a book called The Cloud of Unknowing, and this is a fantastic genre of texts. Some people like Bernard McGinn, he's probably like the foremost contemporary historian of these contemplative practices and practices of mysticism and so on. Calls it the handbook tradition. And the handbooks are they're how-to manuals. So the Cloud of Unknowing has, there's some scripture and biblical exegesis and so on. There's also some philosophical touch points. This is, coming downstream of another anonymous person, Pseudo Dionysius. These are sort of at the intersection of Christianized Neoplatonism from this practice-oriented perspective. It's a very apophatic and contemplative practice. And the Cloud of Unknowing is written as a letter to a younger student. So it gives instruction in the practice, and then it also kind of lets signs and signposts, things to think about, and a little bit of surrounding instruction on how to engage with them. So those would be some of the practices that I've found as especially rich and transformative. But I think, you know, these things like really called out to me, in a big way. I don't think that I sort of sat in the great Amazon shopping mall of texts and just sort of intentionally picked out, oh, I want to do this one and not that one. I want to do this one and not that one. Um, they really sort of gripped me and spoke to me and sort of solicited my attention, and thinking like, oh, there's something here. I need to follow this. Like I feel intuitively different about this one. Maybe it's the aesthetics or just the language or whatever. But then the practices kind of go on to confirm that, like this is the path for you, you know. So yeah, those would be some of them.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Theros. What's going on with Theros?
Yeah.
And what is
So
it? What's the theoria? What is
yeah,
this?
yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm just concept dumping over here. But yeah, so Theros, this really, I mean, it kind of brings the conversation full circle in a nice way. So if we started with attention, practices of attention, um, contemplation, relationship of contemplation to philosophy, then this institutional question about alternative forms. The Theōros Project is my attempt at bringing the practical side and the institutional side together in a very nascent way. I would say it's a small project right now, but so Theros is a lecture and event series that we run here in San Francisco. We do it in person only, on purpose. We feel that there's something important about discussing and exploring philosophy and contemplation and the humanities at large, art, literature, music, and so on, um, in person together, face to face. There's something different and important about that, we feel. But so right now we're starting with this event series, and the premise is basically a little sort of what I described earlier, that like the humanities are having a moment in um, their standard institutional forms for these economic and social and political reasons. Um, but there's also, to me, obviously, like an increased need for them among people, especially not just among college students, academics, and scholars, and so on, but in the world at large. I think people are really looking for orientation, for context, for history, for grounding, for lineage and tradition, and I think that takes multiple different shapes and forms, different political valences, and so on. Um, but so what we want to do is just experiment with sort of alternative institutional forms that can be connected to and allied with what the universities are doing, but also separate from them. There are things that you can do as a small organization that are just much easier to do um, than if you were in a university. So we're doing this event series. The premise is basically like, one, it's a practice oriented approach to the humanities. So the kind of humanities that, or the kind of philosophy I've been describing here, also applies to, like I said, artists and um, writers of literature and so on. Practice oriented approaches to those as well. Um, and then also a sense for realism. So you mentioned before that you sensed like a severance in the university itself, and I think that's right. I think that's astute. So we have like C.P. Snow's famous essay, "The Two Cultures," middle of the 20th century, where you really saw this like pulling apart, or this rift between the humanities and the sciences. Those are the two cultures. Um, the sciences started to gain ascendancy and prestige, and the humanities over time started to lose them. Um, Although before, of course, it was the humanities that were kind of this sort of aristocratic, it's sort of real marker of your like, um, I don't know what you would call it, your status or something like that. It was like kind of like a strong status symbol to be speaking Latin and well read and so on. But anyway, you have that rift, right? And so the the rift is quite deep, and I think it marks actually a really radical change in the university. the university, the uni-inversity, means one, unitary. The original idea was that all of those disciplines across the humanities and the sciences, including religion and theology and so on, were all about the same subject, which was the world, reality, being as a whole. They were all different ways of talking about existence and the role of humans in existence, right? And after this split, we get something different, right? They're not really sold as the same thing anymore. Now the sciences are how we describe reality, the non-human world, what's objectively there, whether we are or not, right? And the humanities have kind of taken on this much more secular and individualized, and I would sort of say like a kind of like developmental and psychological framework kind of organizes them, where I think people still recognize like, yeah, literature and art can be good for you as a person. It can raise all kinds of interesting questions about the subjective experiences we have as human beings, but it's not about reality, is kind of the framing. And so I think we basically lost two things. One, the union of all of these things as in their agreement that they're talking about the same thing. These are different maps of one territory. And two, that one is subjective and the other is objective. And I think those are both wrong premises. So what we want to do is one, have these events, interesting speakers, interesting dialogue, but two, see if we can't bring that back together. So the science and humanities dialogue, but then also this question of realism in the humanities, trying to recover a greater sense for that. So we're starting with the events. And in the future, we're going to continue to do those, but we'd like to do some publishing, some essay writing, and maybe build from there. Maybe at some point down the line, offer some courses, and really just see like what new shapes can these new institutional forms take, and see if we can't carry the humanities forward that way in the 21st century.
Excellent. I wish we had more time. Maybe we'll have to do this again and just focus on this. We touched a little bit on the ideas for institutional transformation, but I think they deserve a much more in-depth exploration. So maybe some other time we can organize that once you've had a
Yeah,
little more
definitely.
practice. Um, maybe you have a couple more minutes, right?
Yeah, I could go 10 more minutes or so.
Okay. I think hopefully this doesn't feel like beating a dead horse. You never exactly tell how the listener is experiencing it. You have to kind of guess. But I would like you to try one last time to sort of pitch the goal. Like a person who has undergone a training of their attention through these various practices. I really loved what you said before about it's like it's always good to gain an awareness of different ideas, but you moved in the direction of like your intuition spoke to you that these were like the right things for you. And I think that's a great methodology actually, to figure out what's the right set of things for you in your context with your particular psyche or whatever. But somebody who undergoes this, what kind of person do they become? And why is it beneficial? Like, how do things, you talk, if we had time, I would quote some of I took out a bunch of quotes, but like, talk about how like the givenness of things, I think, like reveal themselves to you in different ways. Like, could we get into that a little bit, at least a little briefly? Like, what's the, like, how does reality show up differently to you? Like, what is the benefit of putting oneself through this difficult kind of training process? And then the last one, if we have time, you can get to it. Our sort of tagline here at Tusk and Quill is exploring what it means to live well in today's America. So it's kind of a surprise one, but what is you can answer that question. Like to you, what does that mean, or what is needed in order to accomplish that? Any thoughts you have on on that? We can kind of end there.
Sure. So on the attention training, I I'll give you I'll give you two thoughts. One, if you don't participate in the training of your own attention, it's going to be trained for you. and you might not enjoy where that takes you. Um, that's one. The second one, um, an image or a phrase that I really like comes from another philosopher, Peter Sloterdijk, where he talks about ascesis, its philosophical exercises, as possession breaking measures. So if we take seriously what we're talking about in terms of perception, in terms of the differences between people's perception, in terms of how malleable and shapeable experience is at the level of perception, um, it follows that people can train you into seeing the world in very particular ways. And that, again, that doesn't mean that they're going to fill you with an ideology. It does mean that, but it doesn't just mean that. I mean, an ideology that just sits in your head. You are being formed and shaped by an ideology that sits in your perception, in your sensation, in your bodily structure, how you move around in the world, what you see as possible and impossible, what you see as good and bad, what you see as worth pursuing and not pursuing. Um, and so, in a sense, you can be put in a kind of a trance. You can be shaped in a particular direction that serves somebody else's purpose. Um, and you can spend years of your life kind of in that trance. And what the philosophy should do is, again, like Sloterdijk says, it's a possession breaking measure. If you're kind of being possessed by something else, and it could be a system, it's not clear to me that if we're talking about social media and apps and algorithms, it's not clear that you're actually being possessed by a person. You're being possessed by a kind of a human set of computer processes, and that's shaping you. It's all of it's feeding back and reforming you, reforming your perception, reforming your habits. So philosophy, in the sense that I'm talking about, is the possession breaking measure. It should give you some agency in regards to the concepts that you use to organize your perception and move around in the world. Um, that's kind of the baseline. Um, the various philosophies, the schools of philosophy, will then recommend different ways that you should go, and they'll have different strategies and different sort of metaphysical understandings that guide that decision making. So this is the last name I'll mention is Pierre Hadot. I have to mention Hadot at some point. French philosopher. He says this is why choosing a school of philosophy in the Greek sense. So if you're doing Platonism, Aristotelianism, Epicureanism, Stoicism, they all had schools with buildings, right? Like they're actually like places to meet. It's an existential choice, right? And so the practices, one, should make you what should appear to you is that that choice is important, and two, that you can make it, right? So at the very basic level, it's freeing you up to make a voluntary choice. And without these practices, or without some of those experiences, you won't be in a position to do that. So there's a level of agency and facility that emerges on the other side of doing these practices that will change your agency and intentionality in the world. That would be my pitch about what happens and why to do it.
Makes sense. That's great. You got to scare him a little bit,
You had another one. Yeah. Well, did you have
the
another one, or did that get it?
the no the it was the exploring what it means to live well into it. To Adam, when I say what does it mean to live well in today's America, or how can we achieve well-being, for those of us who are living in the U.S. today, just taking that as a context. Now, obviously, everybody in the world is interested in that question, but our sort of framing and context is U.S. focused. So just I'm thinking maybe every podcast guest I'll kind of ask them to reflect on this question, like what does that evoke for you? What thoughts, what ideas, what notions? Like, um, what does it mean to live well in today's America? What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think I think it means that you have to live in active engagement and even struggle with your conception of what's true and good as best as you can figure it. And when you discover that you were wrong or that it ended up not being true, that you're honest about it and that you course correct and that you help other people do the same. And so I think well being is actually a function of that kind of self examination and that kind of service to other people. And I think if you do one or the other, you may not end up in a state of well being. You may not end up in a state of well being either. But I know if you don't do those things, it surely won't happen. You surely won't feel well. You are, and I believe you are in some sense oriented towards the good, but it's a very murky and complicated question. But the grappling with it does does yield dividends in the sense of like fulfillment.
Okay, great. Have good epistem not to oversimplify, but it seems it's very related to epistemology and how you make sense of the world, but then also being open to how the meta process, how you change how you make sense of the world, and then sharing what you learn with others, something of that nature.
I would say so, but the again the we tend to think of epistemology and goodness as two
Yeah.
separate things, and I don't think they're separate. So
Okay.
again, it's that side of it's the spiritual development, the virtue development transforms the epistemology. You could call it a kind of virtue epistemology if
Totally.
you wanted.
Totally. All right. Thank you, Adam. Thanks for taking all this time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, this was great.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for having me. I hope this was good and helpful and interesting.
Yes. And we'll do all the follow Adam on Twitter, Substack. We'll put all the links in the description if you wanna find him. Thank you.
Cool. Great. Thanks so much.